building nuclear on budget and on time might be more challenging than, a camel passing through the eye of a needle. But if we do it and we do it well and we really learn those lessons and ignore a lot of what the industry has been hyping, the value proposition is enormous. And I think that's the case certainly where I live in Ontario, where nuclear is the second cheapest source of electricity, supports a really vibrant local economy.
Good evening and welcome to the CIS. I'm Alex Bainton and I'm part of the energy team here. We are a public policy focused research organisation that has existed for nearly half a century. In the past year, we've also been focused on supporting sound policy to deliver affordable and reliable energy, and investigating the significant failures of our public institutions to deliver a technology-neutral transition that gets us to low emissions at low cost. And this brings me to tonight's event. Dr. Chris Keefer founded Canadians for Nuclear Energy and is host of the Decouple podcast. Why Canada? Well, in our team's work, we've found that nuclear energy is a little like healthcare. You want to learn from the Canadians, not the Americans. And Australia and Canada really do have several similarities, with vast continents and relatively small populations, mostly concentrated in dense urban pockets. Both are endowed with considerable renewable energy resources and uranium resources too. Canada's nuclear journey is therefore filled with lessons for Australia. Why did Canada create its own unique reactor design? How did it help them phase out coal? Why doesn't Quebec have any reactors? And how does nuclear energy fit with renewables? Aidan Morrison is the director of the energy program here at the CIS and has a background in physics, data analysis, and public policy. He's also been my boss for the last 12 months and is the only person I know whose energy density exceeds that of uranium. He's going to be speaking to Australia's situation, and then Dr. Keefer will speak to Canada's. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Morrison to the stage.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that warm introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming tonight. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Keefer. Chris, as I've come to know him well over the last few days, and we met last year, it's been an absolute privilege to do a little bit of a tour of Victoria so far and starting now in New South Wales. I'm really looking forward to this event tonight. So my role for the moment, I just want to set the scene, I suppose, a little bit in the Australian context and explain a little bit of where I perceive the debate is currently at in Australia, and tell you a little bit about what CIS here and our energy team is doing to progress the debate at the moment. We all know that energy is absolutely crucial for the ongoing support of our society. There is a fairly broad consensus in Australia that we want to do something to decarbonise the economy as well. But the right way to do that comes down, in our debate in Australia, to this critical question about cost. What is the cheapest way of us producing a flourishing society that hopefully can flourish without a very large carbon footprint? Now, in Australia, that debate has been characterised largely by a report called the CSIRO Gen Cost Report, which only about a year ago was saying that nuclear power was 6 times as expensive than the integrated renewable energy that might substitute it. And we're very proud of our work here at the Centre for Independent Studies in being able to help in eliciting a substantial concession that the CSIRO had no business in excluding large-scale nuclear, which is the proven type of nuclear, or that's well accepted around the world. And then when you consider that, the cost might now be, in their opinion, less than or around about 2 times their estimate for integrated renewables. Now, I have lots of different things that I could contend about their estimate for integrated renewables, which could take up all of tonight if I dove into too much detail. But to say the least, there is significant movement afoot in that debate. And in particular, things like looking at the life of reactors, which CSIRO did not account for, limiting it to 30 years instead of the likely 60, 80 or 100, as well as the capacity factor of nuclear to operate 90% of the time, assuming that it would likely operate more like our coal fleet does at 60% of the time, are kind of clear errors that show that nuclear is almost certainly very cost competitive within the CSIRO's estimate. Now, I think at the moment there is really just two visions, I think, that can surmise kind of what are the different views that are encapsulating the situation, the current energy debate. The question is, where are we today? There is no doubt that renewables on their own, at very small amounts, if you just pay for the panel or just pay for the turbine on their own, produce very cheap electricity. If you're willing to accept it, just at the times and in the places when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And it's broadly acknowledged that the more you try to push of that type of energy into your system, the higher penetrations of that intermittent, uncontrollable energy, the more supporting additional infrastructure you have to add to that system. Storage systems such as battery and pumped hydro, transmission systems to move the energy further around the country from places that have too much at one time to other places that don't have enough. These are broadly acknowledged features of the debate. The question that I think defines our current position is, are we at a place now where renewables, to continue adding to them, are still so cheap that we can continue adding all the additional supporting infrastructure, such as batteries, firming gas, pumped hydro, and it will still be cheaper than the electricity system we currently have today? That is the position broadly, I think, of the government narrative. They assume that we have the economic tailwind behind us. We just need to do things to unlock, just help things get moving. And the good force of market economics will propel more renewables into the system and propel them right up to the extent of 82% or above. That seems to be the popular narrative that is assumed that renewables help push down your electricity prices just as much as they push down carbon emissions for the grid. There's an alternative view, which I think is much more likely. And that is that renewable energy, to continue advancing it into our grid above 35, above 40%, is probably more expensive at the moment. And it will only get more and more expensive as we add higher and higher proportions of supporting infrastructure, the transmission, the storage, to move the energy further around the clock, around the country, and around the calendar to make good use of it. Now, I think the evidence is actually in many different places. It is, I think, quite abundantly clear. Sometimes it is hiding in plain sight in the names of documents, in the institutions and subsidy schemes we stand up. Sometimes it's buried in the detail, but still there if you dig deep enough and you know where to look for it. And sometimes it is withheld from public view, sometimes even put under lock and key. And I'm particularly proud of the work of the Centre for Independent Studies in being able to go through all those three levels of depth and detail and secrecy in order to uncover the best evidence to expose where we are currently at today. So things that are kind of roughly in plain sight. We have a subsidy scheme in Australia called the Capacity Investment Scheme that is basically being used to underwrite enough investment in renewables to meet the targets. They call it an auction, which means they basically ask the companies how much money they need to have underwritten to keep investing, and the government finds the sequence of lowest costs but commits to enough projects at their requested prices to build that energy infrastructure. We also have the Integrated System Plan, which, despite being claimed to be a whole-of-system document, does not add up a whole-of-system price. You would think for the resources poured into those sorts of planning documents, if they wanted to tell us what the full system would cost, they probably would. But there are other elements that are buried one level down in further detail, such as the fact that consumer energy resources, which are regarded by the CEO of AEMO to be indispensable to the future energy system, are simply not factored in as a cost to be optimised in the Integrated System Plan. There's also the question of perfect foresight, the assumption that we know the weather every half hour, 25 years in advance, so that we can build the right amount of infrastructure to account for La Niñas and El Niños in the perfect year, charge the batteries, fill the dams at the perfect times to get us through with reliable electricity. Also the question of hydrogen, which is assumed in the most likely scenario of the ISP to be a flexible load that can turn on as a solar sink and only operate at a capacity of 30 or 40% to soak up solar power whilst smoothing out the demand profile of the whole economy. Again, at no cost to the whole system that is modelled in the ISP. But there's also a particular class of evidence which I'm particularly proud of the CIS energy team being able to dive into. And that are the things that are hidden, that are unavailable to us, which we are doing our best to seek and finding difficulty. And the degree of deception that is being exercised in order to prevent the true picture becoming crystal clear to the society, I think is often evidenced in these types of documents. The business case for Snowy Hydro 2.0, the major storage system that was proposed by Malcolm Turnbull to be key to unlocking the future of renewables, is still not public. And we've sought to seek, using FOIs, what was the revised business case when the cost went from $2 to $12 billion that justified the ongoing investment. Of course, none of that was given to us. All the details from those documents are entirely redacted. We also have, from our pursuit, appealing FOIs that came back largely redacted, the acknowledgement from AEMO that they were not at liberty to share with even the government department what the cost of the carbon constraints are on the ISP. This would be the simplest rule of thumb to expose how much extra we pay per tonne of carbon that we're abating, and the fact that they are not even sharing that with the department responsible for running the subsidy scheme that makes it happen tells you an awful lot. But in particular, and this is a crucial focus right at the moment, is the business case for transmission. This is the supporting infrastructure that is placed onto the consumers. This is the thing that's funded by the regulated asset base. We all pay for it. It's an incompressible part of the cost of electricity. And once we build it, it lasts for an awfully long time, and we are stuck with that cost no matter what we do. And we have been diving very deep into the details of the processes that see those major projects approved, and we find them come up terribly, terribly wanting. Just this afternoon, I've had the privilege of getting back together with my team after a few days on the road with Chris, and discovered that from one of the most recent Freedom of Information requests that we got back from the Australian Energy Market Commission, there were 247 documents provided to us. We had temporary access to a particular private drive to read this. We find acknowledgement of what I think is exactly what a superficial glance at the whole process would expect. These companies that are advancing this are advancing it in their own private interest to get the maximum investment to occur, and they have no intention of waiting for the process that will reveal the true cost of the project, which may lead to them being pushed back or cancelled entirely when the prices rise. In fact, we've found here in one of the documents them sharing with the regulatory organisations, in this case the Market Commission, that they have no intention of considering delaying their projects. And here's a little quote. In practice, the final investment decision is made at or before CPA 1. And to explain, CPA 1 is meant to be the early work stage that determines the detailed cost, so we know whether it's good value to proceed or not. It's not realistic for a transmission network system provider to decide not to proceed with a project at the end of CPA 2. CPA 2 is when you should be making the decision about whether it makes sense to actually proceed. Too much reputational risk for a project to not proceed. Investors need to commit capital much earlier in the process. This is exactly the kind of worst fear that we have, is that the tail is wagging the dog. The private interests are being used to motivate a process that basically prevents the cost-benefit analysis we all rely on to keep inefficient investments out of the system is essentially what's driving this process. And so we're very much looking forward in the coming weeks and months to be contributing to a Senate inquiry into the regulatory and planning process to continue to engage with this, to challenge the institutions to make sure they get the very best value out of this energy transition for Australian consumers. So that lays the scene for, I think, the Australian situation. Cost is crucial for us. The government thinks that it is still so cheap that we can rely on the market with just a little bit of unsticking to drive more renewable into the energy system. And yet we find from the evidence around us that that's not the case. Electricity costs are rising for consumers all the time. And in that context, I think it's essential that we consider alternative methods of providing low-cost, reliable energy for our society. It's essential that we consider nuclear power, because even if it costs a little bit more potentially than the system we know today, there is no chance, in my opinion, that is going to cost much more than the experimental system to reach over 90% renewable energies from a source that we cannot control. And so I'd like to very much welcome to the stage Dr. Chris Keefer, who has been one of the best advocates globally for nuclear power, to tell what I think is an outstanding story of what he and the organisations that he works with has done to revive and redirect and course correct the nuclear industry in Canada, North America and the globe, and what Australia can learn, particularly from the Canadian experience that they have had in developing nuclear power. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Keefer.
Really impressed actually by all of the reports that I've seen coming out of CIS on energy. Aidan came across my radar just over a year ago when he blew the lid off of the sunk costs hidden within the Gen Cost report. And I had the pleasure of having him on the podcast, and it's been really wonderful watching this muckraker sort through the, to an outsider, very confusing alphabet soup of acronyms behind all of the various modeling agencies. And I really do see the role of Aidan and the energy team here as the child in the famous fairy tale about the emperor not wearing any clothes. So someone is finally saying it, and they're doing it in a very data-informed manner, and I think it's having a tremendous impact. Just to fluff the feathers of the CIS energy team a little bit more, I'm often asked, is there some sort of central repository of answers, an FAQ maybe, to answer the burning questions that people have about nuclear? I'd been planning on actually getting one going through my media company, Decouple Media. Never quite got it to fruition. And so great seeing the work again that the team has done here. I'm not sure if it's called the Nuclear FAQ. That's what it is. Look it up, Google it, you'll find it. It's really outstanding. All right, so let's get into the meat and potatoes here. There's a quote, it's probably misattributed to Euripides, but he says, "Man is blind until he has a metaphor that allows him to see." And so as a medical doctor who's waded into the energy debate, when I look at the grid, I don't just see generators, wires, and poles. I see a civilizational life support system, somewhat analogous maybe to an anesthetic machine or a dialysis machine or a respirator. And it's extraordinary to me the way that we are tinkering with it, the way that we are sort of playing around willy-nilly with something that is, so vital but so taken for granted. But also, how we construct the grid really shapes the kind of civilization and society that we have. And I think that really demands careful thought. So I want you to keep your eyes open, but imagine a world of rolling blackouts, halted factories, and hospitals scrambling to keep equipment running. It's not a dystopian novel. It's a situation and a reality that developing nations are doing an admirable job leaving in their past. But strangely enough, developed nations are paradoxically flirting with more and more. And one has to look no further than Europe, which I think has the distinction of being farthest along on that path, and Germany, which is seeing some reduction in emissions and coal use, but largely due to the flight of German industry. And one of the places that German industry is landing is actually in nuclear-powered Ontario. Volkswagen's first foreign factory is under planning in Ontario. Ideological green policies are causing high costs, unreliable electricity, and the resulting deindustrialization. And I think Australia similarly finds itself at a crossroads. Like many countries, or really every country in the developed world, it's benefiting from the investments made by previous generations and the extraordinary infrastructure that has been constructed. Aidan and I managed to score a real VIP tour with the general manager at Loy Yang and tour that incredible facility. We can have lots of different thoughts about coal, but just standing there and observing, this 100-meter tall building. We were up on the 17th story looking out at the coal pits and just the extraordinary engineering and infrastructure that we were standing on. It almost feels like something that's distant to our generation in terms of our capacities. So I think the stakes are high, and if you'll allow me as a diagnostician to make a few comments, as a foreigner about Australia, I see, again, this grid can really determine the economic fabric and the geopolitical position that Australia has for decades to come. Globalization, I think a touch of the Dutch disease due to the comparative advantage in the dig and ship mineral sector, has led to a drop in Australia's economic complexity. In fact, the Economic Complexity Index shows that Australia's dropped from 55th to 93rd position since 1995, with a distinction of landing just above Uganda, but behind Pakistan. Now, this, of course, doesn't speak to the full story. There's 50 times greater GDP here in Australia, but I think that is, cause for concern, particularly as we enter into an increasingly unstable geopolitical situation where, the talk certainly in North America is that we have offshored critical industry, we've offshored strategic industry, and there's a lot of moves afoot with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the CHIPS Act, to reshore that industry as a question of national security. And so we have to ask ourselves, how will the choice and the way that we construct the electric grid impact the productive economy, which is really what underpins a service economy, and the entitlements that I think we all value, like healthcare, education, and pensions? This is a rhetorical question, but I think we all intuitively know the answer to it. Can a wind, solar, and battery electricity system support the manufacturing and value-add industries like mineral processing and petrochemical refining? So I posit there are two paths forward. One is reliance on weather-dependent, often made-in-China technology, a Rube Goldberg machine, composed of, but not limited to, rooftop panels, inverters, home batteries, synchronous condensers, a labyrinthine transmission network. We met with angry farmers in St. Arnaud, Victoria, who were protesting those. Two-way distribution. I mean, the list goes on. And again, that willingness to sort of open up the ventilator and start shifting the wires around, this requires extreme caution. And I'm not seeing that in terms of the way that we are modeling and discussing the grid. This creates a complex network, and it's vulnerable to what we call common mode failures. And these are simple things like the sun going down or a calm, windless day. The one thing I will say about this system is the individual construction parts, building a solar farm. This is a achievable, fairly simple, low-risk, financeable construction project. And I think for that reason, it's very enticing, particularly in our current situation, which has been the result of offshoring of much of our industry and a real loss of capacity in the Western world. The other option, of course, is a dependable grid, powered, I think, in part by large-scale nuclear infrastructure, and it's capable of supporting reindustrialization and that reshoring that is so necessary. However, it does represent a challenging construction mega project, and that should not be taken lightly. And I think we'll have some great discussions afterwards about how to thread that needle. Neither path is going to be quick or easy. We were talking with James Flay, who I think works with Ted O'Brien, someone I've also had on the podcast and who I have a tremendous respect for. And he was commenting, listen, the coal fleet is cheap now, but when we built it, that was a major investment. It was amortized and is now providing the cheapest power on the electricity grid. But regardless, I think the infrastructure is aged. Either there needs to be massive refurbishment or construction of new assets, and that is going to cost something. All right, so I want to tell you a story of a potential model in Ontario and also a cautionary tale. We have many similarities as Commonwealth cousins, shared values, shared institutions. We've fought in the same wars, although we didn't get entangled in Vietnam. A big distinguishing difference, particularly between Ontario and Australia, is that we don't have any coal, and that really led to a divergent path. So I want to tell you about a success story, which was really an energy security play to reduce our dependence on imported U.S. coal. We commissioned 20 large nuclear reactors in just 22 years, a really extraordinary pace of deployment. It powered a booming, growing industrial economy, a vibrant automotive sector, and at the same time resulted in accidental decarbonization, which I really argue is the best kind. I also have a cautionary tale for you. We adopted a Germany-inspired renewable energy policy called the Green Energy Act, which resulted in $62 billion cost from above-market feed-in tariffs. An interesting comparison is that the inflation-adjusted cost of building our entire nuclear fleet, those 20 nuclear reactors, is less than what we are spending on these contracts, which will not expire for another 10 to 15 years, and again, saddle us with high costs. And that's really what's made Ontario prices unacceptable, But then I came to Australia and saw that the retail prices are double. So I want to tell you a story of reversal tonight. The situation was indeed bleak 4 years ago. There was a massive spike in prices related to those expenditures. And Ontario was set to close 1/4 of its nuclear fleet and lay off 1/4 of its nuclear workforce. The 3,100 megawatt Pickering Nuclear Generating Station was being excluded from the refurbishments, which we're doing on all the rest of our CANDU reactors, which buys them another 30 to 40 years of life. Our federal government was also very anti-nuclear, in part due to the influence of powerful environmental NGOs, who interestingly had really infiltrated some of the highest offices, not in terms of the politicians, but in terms of the staffers. And I'll talk a little bit about that influence later. Into that mess stepped a small group of nuclear advocates who succeeded at recentering Ontario energy policy on nuclear by exploiting a political realignment between blue-collar trade unions and a populist conservative movement. The partnership became known as the Blue-Blue Alliance, and I really look forward to sharing that story with you tonight. Together, working with mostly labor unions, we reversed the decision to close Pickering, and there are now plans afoot for a 50% expansion of our nuclear fleet. I'm going to continue the story in 3 chapters. I want to tell you the story in chapter 1 of the development of the CANDU nuclear power system. In chapter 2, I will explain the rise and fall of the Green Energy Act and its costly consequences. And in chapter 3, I'll reflect on the political strategy behind our successful advocacy. So chapter 1, how did a colonial backwater like Canada become the world's second largest research center for nuclear? It's a bold beginning. In World War II, the French agent of the Deuxième Bureau, Jacques Allier, pulled off a daring caper. He managed to, under the noses of the Nazis who were invading any day Norway, he managed to smuggle out basically the entire world's supply of heavy water, first to France, then to the UK. It was stored in the Windsor Library, and finally to Canada. And following that heavy water came really the British bomb program, which was actually ahead of the Manhattan Project at that time, where they relocated to Canada and set up research centers in Montreal and in Chalk River. This led to some pretty incredible Canadian nuclear milestones. In 1945, in Canada, the first controlled chain reaction in a nuclear reactor occurred outside of the US. In 1947, we opened the NRX reactor, which was the most powerful research reactor in the world, and it really set us on a path to dominate in the field of medical isotopes, which is something we remain at the forefront of. We are very appreciative as well of the Australian medical isotope industry, but I'll do the American thing of saying we're number one on that. And we also pioneered a unique reactor system. And this is really part of a massive transformation post-World War II. We moved from a natural resource extraction and export economy with loyalty to the mother country to a impressive industrialization. Before World War II, we had a standing army of 4,000 men and 2 tanks. And we did something truly extraordinary in terms of our contributions to the war effort, not just in the bravery and valiantry of our soldiers, but in our industrial production. We produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than the Axis powers combined, 700 warships, and 16,000 military aircraft, which gave us the 4th largest air force in the world. Post-war, there was the question of what to do with this incredible industrial and nuclear capacity. And under the brilliant leadership of C.D. Howe, we decided that we would no longer be just hewers of wood and drawers of water, but splitters of atoms. So why did we develop our own nuclear reactor design and concept? And I'll note it is one of 3 that have survived through what I'll call the nuclear reactor Hunger Games to be commercially and operationally viable around the world. Energy independence was of top concern to us. We quickly exhausted our hydroelectric resources in Ontario, and as I mentioned, had no indigenous coal and were reliant on imports. We also did not have the heavy forging capacities to create the US-style reactors, and we did not have uranium enrichment capabilities as well. And so through the use of that heavy water that I mentioned, the French initially, stewarding out of Norway, we were able to develop this unique design. Again, 20 reactors in 22 years. We exported 12 reactors internationally, and there have been 18 CANDU clones built by the Indians, making, again, the third most deployed reactor in the world. The performance has been amazing. We've set the record in terms of the longest runtime of any thermal plant, over 3 years straight, with one of our CANDU units in Darlington. So, very, very proud Canadian. The last thing I'll say, though, is that we do see an incredible economic multiplier as a result of the localization that we have, both through creating our own design and the localization that just tends to accompany a nuclear sector. So when we invest $1 in our CANDU refurbishments, we see $1.40 back in GDP. And that is because nuclear, in terms of its expenses, one of the major expenses, the fuel is cheap. It's the high quality jobs which really uplift human capacity and potential, and I think serve as the ultimate economic stimulus for an economy. Let's move into chapter 2, our foray into a German-inspired renewable energy path. Ever since the age of Edison's Pearl Station, we saw steady electricity growth, 7 to 8% per year, compounding and compounding. Regulated monopoly and public utilities use supply planning with guaranteed rates of returns and cost-plus financing to meet that demand. Ontario Hydro, our public utility, went on a building spree, 7 gigawatts of hydroelectricity, 7 gigawatts of coal, 13 gigawatts of nuclear. And the joke at the time was that this utility was a construction company that happened to make a bit of electricity on the side. That demand growth stalled in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and really threw this traditional monopoly utility model into crisis. Into this void stepped Amory Lovins with the soft energy path, with an emphasis on small-scale renewable energy and conservation to meet the very modest growth that we saw over the ensuing decades. And the expression of that in Ontario was something we call the now infamous Ontario Green Energy Act. It was spurred on by a number of environmental NGOs and renewable industry groups, and its goal wasn't that we needed the power at the time. The goal was in the context of the global financial crisis and the collapse of some of our automotive sector, was to kickstart the economy. We wanted to retool distressed auto plants to become wind turbine manufacturers and solar panel manufacturers, and we actually had a guarantee in there that we would have local content in province, 50% of the solar panels, 60% of the wind turbines. This was challenged by Japan and the EU, the WTO, and those jobs melted away. But how did we fund this? We offered 20-year contracts, high feed-in tariffs, far above market value to private investors. For wind, 15 cents a kilowatt hour. For solar, up to 80 cents a kilowatt hour. And this all occurred in the context of a wholesale price of just 4 cents. The economic consequences were devastating. Our prices increased by over 70% between 2008, when the Green Energy Act came into being, and 2016. The promised jobs failed to materialize. There was a WTO ruling which struck down the protective provisions. The jobs created were very low quality. They paid little over minimum wage, largely amounting to mounting solar panels, applying glass and aluminum frames. There was a net loss of 75,000 jobs due to high energy costs and the resulting deindustrialization. The environmental outcomes were not very impressive. You're adding wind and solar to a grid that's already deeply decarbonized with nuclear and hydroelectricity, so it represented an extraordinarily low return on investment. Lastly, and something that's a little bit egregious, I'm all for charity, but I don't think that Canada owes any particular charity to the US. We tend to overproduce. Our wind produces violently out of phase with demand, and so in the spring and fall, we buy wind. We're forced to buy wind. Every kilowatt that they produce, regardless if it's curtailed, 15 cents a kilowatt hour, it's surplus, and we send it down at negative prices to the United States just to get rid of it. So it's had a really devastating economic impact. That cost alone of that wind generation at 15 cents a kilowatt hour displacing hydroelectricity at 5 cents a kilowatt hour results in over $1 billion in excess charges. I want to move to a more hopeful chapter now, and that is chapter 3, the return to nuclear. As I mentioned before, we were at a real crisis point in 2020 with plans to retire the Pickering nuclear station. Our federal government, still in power, much more pro-nuclear now, was very hostile. Our Minister of Environment and Climate Change had earned the moniker Green Jesus. He has a nice beard. He rappelled off of the CN Tower in a kind of iconic protest move. Trudeau's chief of staff and many other key staffers in his office were former World Wildlife Fund executives. And our Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, publicly was defending the German coal phase-out in the context of skyrocketing gas prices after the Russian invasion. And for a limited time, Germany actually funding that atrocity through continuing to buy gas. Nuclear was labeled a sin stock in our green bond framework. So things were not looking very good. And just to comment briefly on the pernicious influence of environmental NGOs in this setting. These groups are well funded. I have to admit they have an impressive ground game and work ethic, but they cultivate through their organizations very capable people who go on to, I think, play a behind-the-scenes role, at least within Canadian politics, again, staffing the office of major politicians. And I've learned in my lobbying efforts, the key thing is to treat the staffers with incredible respect, build those relationships, get their WhatsApp number, and the rest is history. So the environmental NGOs were very, very powerful. We needed to form a countervailing force within civil society. And so with that intent, I co-founded Canadians for Nuclear Energy in 2020. Very quickly, to have some kind of influence, I decided we needed to have a base. And I think there's a tendency, with contentious debates like this, to argue with those who argue back most loudly with you. Trying to convert environmentalists into being pro-nuclear is astonishingly difficult. It's possible, and you can spend a lifetime at it, but the return on investment is very low. So not being satisfied with that, I looked around and I said, there's a natural constituency here, and it's the 89,000 people working in this sector who know the technology, believe in the technology, and benefit from the technology. And you'll find, again, workers in the CANDU sector who say, this technology has fed my family now for 3 generations. These are the kind of intergenerational secure jobs that I think we romanticize when we talk about something like the just transition, the kind of job where a single income could support a family, get a couple cars in the driveway, send the kids to college. Those jobs are very rare in today's age, and they are bursting at the seams within nuclear. So how to activate this, what I'll argue is a very potent political base. There was a certain amount of stigma in the air. And most of these workers, kept their heads down. Our messaging really focused on elevating them as clean air and climate heroes. Our advocacy to save the Pickering nuclear station, which I have to set the scene for you a little bit, it was considered utterly quixotic what we were up to. The unions obviously would love to see the refurbishment. It would result in continuing jobs, 7,200 direct and indirect jobs from the plant, and many jobs in the skilled trades in the refurbishment. But they'd given up. The industry had decided it's a done deal. They bought the gas plants to replace the output of the nuclear station. And so confident was a prominent industry executive that in 2021, I made him a bet. I said, we're going to save Pickering, and I'll bet you $1,000 we'll do it. He said, I'd take it easy. And I'm like, well, if you're so confident, I'd like 100 to 1 odds. And he said, no problem. I have not been paid my $100,000 yet. We needed a contract. What can I say? So our tactics ranged, but one thing I learned was, why reinvent the wheel? The environmental NGOs have been campaigning for a long time. What can I learn from them? And there's a very interesting mechanism. I'm not sure if you have it in Australia. It's called the House of Commons petition. And so with enough signatures and a sponsoring MP, you can get your petition read on the floor of the House of Commons, and it mandates a government response. And that really opened the doors in Ottawa politically for me. But what was the theory behind gaining this influence and turning both the centrist and left-wing parties more pro-nuclear and really harnessing an emerging phenomena that I think Canada is really at the forefront of? And again, that is this blue-blue alliance between blue-collar labor and a populist conservative movement. So in 2018, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, came to power, and it was truly extraordinary that he had the backing of a number of construction unions, primarily the Boilermakers. This creates an almost unassailable, you never want to say that in politics, but almost unassailable political alliance where the rural areas and the suburbs were a secure vote. But, if you think about the industrial areas, they're often important political ridings, and they're very secure and held by the left. But the left has become, it has a very conflicted base now. It's the party now of the urban chattering class, the urban elites, the highly educated. But it's seeking to represent their values, which are centered more on identity politics and environmentalism, and really leaving behind the needs of blue-collar workers, those people that I will call those who shower after work. Right? Their jobs depend on infrastructure projects, on building things, whereas the urban elites are, enamored with things like degrowth. And so there's this tension that's developed. And so it led to a really useful wedging tool that I was able to apply a number of times and, sort of pull them kicking and screaming, at least away from anti-nuclearism. Because, there's a key seat in one of the automotive strongholds, which the left party held by only 700 votes, a fraction of a percent in the last election. And they were sponsoring an anti-nuclear event. And I kind of pointed out this contradiction, and it was really amazing seeing the transformation that occurred there. So I'll just close by saying again, and posing this dilemma that I think Australia finds itself in. It's not alone. Again, I think Europe's maybe a little further down the path, but we're seeing a path dependency develop. As we visited the farmers up in St. Arnaud, these interconnector transmission lines really serve one purpose and one purpose alone, and those become a sunk cost if this bold experiment in renewable energy doesn't work out. And the choice is really between, again, the kind of societies that the grid determines. I've actually worked in my hospital when a construction crew cut our connection to the grid, and we were in an utter panic. I mean, you're load shedding within the hospital. Strangely, the vending machine stayed on. That was really weird. So did the ventilators and the dialysis machines, but we were pretty nervous. So, I mean, again, that kind of crassness and levity with which people talk about, again, what I will argue is a civilization life support structure is important. What nuclear offers Australia, what it really offers the world, we see this repeated over and over again, is a localization of a supply chain with incredibly high quality jobs. And in terms of like my core values, leaving aside, any kind of partisan politics, what motivates me is really human flourishing. It's seeing human capacity, whether it's, my son or his friends at school, seeing them developing, gaining mastery, whether it's in martial arts or math. That's what I love seeing, and I think that's something that I really do see in the nuclear sector. So I think I'll leave it there. I think we'll have a lively discussion. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for the warm welcome to Australia.
Thank you so much for that brilliant talk, Chris. It's great to get an international perspective. Australia occasionally feels like we're a long way from the rest of the world, but you've brought the Canadian story very close to us. I'd like to start just by diving in a little bit further to that political transformation that you described, where there's now a potential entry point, the Blue-Blue Alliance, and you stopped the headbutting with the kind of dyed-in-the-wool opponents and found a constituency that you had 89,000 workers. Can you give us any advice to how to start something like that in Australia when we have no nuclear workers yet? And is there any way that you can give us a hint on how to stop what seems like a very combative adversarial debate here in Australia?
It is interesting. Obviously there's a traditional animosity between the union movement and conservative politics. That's undeniable. And I think Canada is really at the forefront of a major shift there. And it's not an alliance with all of labor, all of the trades unions. It's an alliance with the private sector skilled trades unions. Nurses, teachers, government bureaucrat unions are not about to align with that side of conservative politics, because conservative politics, I think, wants to keep prices down, needs to control wages to some degree there. But again, we're seeing what Thomas Piketty calls this political realignment. He's a brilliant French economist. He talks about the emergence of a Brahmin left, where the new base of left-wing parties is this educated elite, urbanized. And so I think, we're seeing that with Doug Ford. We're seeing that with Pierre Poilievre, who it's absolutely undoubtable will be our next prime minister, just kind of a matter of time. And it's a very, very interesting phenomenon. How that develops in Australia, I'm not sure. I was, just a couple elections ago federally, I was quite struck by the Conservative leader talking about, using language, but also things that were not just symbolic. He was talking about the need to have, union and worker representation on corporate boards. It was really bizarre hearing that coming from a politician on the political right. So I think the politics needs to change. You don't have that benefit of momentum and inertia that comes from having this sector that is self-interested. I met with someone from the AMU last time I was here. I understand the previous leader was very pro-nuclear and saw the potential benefits. But I understand there's other unions like the ETU that are quite happy putting up endless transmission towers, and there's lots of work there. So I think Canada's really worth paying attention to. We're seeing a real political transformation, but I'm not sure if I can distill it quite down for you and provide you the exact path.
Well, let's go back to a point of potential conflict that we have in Australia on the political spectrum. I'd like you to share a little bit kind of where you fit on the spectrum of climate concern. How big a problem and how urgent a problem do you think it is for us? And then also fill in for us how likely you think it is that we will meet net zero 2050 or any other kind of, relevant climate goal. Because I know you sit in a slightly rare kind of position on that two-dimensional spectrum. Can you explain what it's like being a sort of slight outlier there?
Sure. I'm fascinated with taxonomies and classifications, and I find it's a really useful way to detoxify political debate, to understand that you are part of something much bigger than yourself, and to see that your political opponents are, again, just part of a different way of considering and looking at the world. And I've grown to be very liberal in that sense of appreciating multiple viewpoints. But when it comes to climate concern and climate action, shall we say, there's a number of places to put yourself on that spectrum. Aidan, as you were kind of hinting at, I do occupy a space as someone who is very climate concerned, but I'm also a climate realist. There's a study that was very impactful for me when I read it. It's a rather old study, but it's from the EPA, and it was looking at the impact of different measures to slow down arriving at 2 degrees C, which they accurately predicted happens when we double concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere from pre-industrial levels. And what it found was a 300% carbon tax initiated 40 years ago would result in about a 10-year delay of getting to 2 degrees C. And a complete ban on coal burning and the use of shale oil starting in the year 2000 would delay things by about 18 years. Now, through gaining more and more energy literacy, reading the works of Václav Smil, Richard Rhodes, and others, you really come to this conclusion once you see how the sausage gets made in the material world and the energy world that, we're almost a new species. We're Homo sapiens, but we're also Homo industrialis. And the incredible carrying capacities that we've achieved are facilitated by and utterly dependent on the use of fossil fuels. I don't see them disappearing anytime soon. There's obviously a great temptation to see nuclear as this swap-in that can replace all fossil fuel services. That's a total fantasy. And so I think there's kind of a groupthink that goes on, amongst politicians. It puts you in a very divergent space to, again, say the emperor's not wearing any clothes and net zero by 2050. Are you kidding me? And it's interesting, talking a lot in this Australian context about modeling and faith in the modelers and the assumptions and biases that you're discovering. If you look at, the IPCC trajectories towards getting to net zero, they rely on preposterous assumptions. Bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage. For the kind of negative emissions they're forecasting, we would need to cultivate an area 3 times the landmass of India with fast-growing crops, fertilized with fossil fuel inputs, right? Because that's how you really get the productivity, burned in power plants, and then put underground in an utterly non-existent industry using technology that's very premature. So I think we need to be much more realist. It is an uncomfortable position for me to occupy as someone who's very concerned. but I think is very realistic. And obviously, we need to make sure that we're weighting a variety of priorities in dealing with the climate issue.
Great. I want you to describe for me the worst enemy of nuclear energy. Tell us, is there a mindset or a mentality? Because we've had a lot of, I suppose, old kind of fear of war, weapons, waste, etc. that might be starting to ebb and change here. But can you just tell us, in your opinion, what's the mentality or mindset that is the worst enemy of nuclear?
Unfortunately, the worst enemy of nuclear right now is the nuclear industry. We've been on a 10-plus year real divergence from common sense with the hype about small modular reactors, for instance, with ideas about so-called advanced nuclear, what I'll call failed to advanced nuclear technologies. And, the industry has, these were reasons behind, for instance, the SMR hype train. Again, primarily, we were not seeing big demand growth, and you don't put capital-intensive gigawatt-scale generators on a grid if you're not sure if you'll have customers for the kilowatt hours. It was sort of a survival mechanism to say, maybe we could go small. But this violates all of the cost curves we see within nuclear, where the big drops in cost are very rapid increases in economy of scale. And so we see, from the US, the first commercial reactor at Shippingport, we see an order of magnitude change from 100 megawatts up to 1,000 megawatts within just 10 years, getting to the Zion nuclear station. The nuclear industry has been very successful at its marketing and branding and convinced a lot of policymakers. And again, I'll come back to that opening quote I had, man is blind until he has a metaphor that allows him to see. There are so many category errors that are possible to make because nuclear is its own special snowflake. And there's a lot behind it. I want to be careful not to rant on too long, but I think, again, the energy team at the CAS have done a great job with the report on how to deliver low-cost nuclear, lessons from the world. I genuinely appreciate that report. This sort of work is not being done sufficiently. And identifying those best practices. One might say, building nuclear on budget and on time might be more challenging than, a camel passing through the eye of a needle. But if we do it and we do it well and we really learn those lessons and ignore a lot of what the industry has been hyping, the value proposition is enormous. And I think that's the case certainly where I live in Ontario, where nuclear is the second cheapest source of electricity, supports a really vibrant local economy. And obviously I could go on, but
I want you to go on a little bit more because what you've described there, I think, sounds strange to a lot of Australian ears, particularly around small modular reactors. There was a time not long ago, probably only a year ago, that there was no mention of nuclear, and there was a party in Australia that was promoting nuclear very strongly. Small modular reactors were the only words that were referred to in any press release or any correspondence. So what's wrong with small modular reactors specifically, and why are you so sure they're never going to be a big hit? And I'd also like you to tell us a story about how basically, because he'll be modest if we don't pry this out of him, how you and the community built around the Decouple podcast managed to turn that around.
So the term small modular reactors is a marketing and branding term. And I hate imprecise terms, and it reminds me a lot of the term renewables, which aggregates together a lot of dislike sources of power, such as dispatchable hydroelectricity with intermittent wind and solar, biomass, etc. But when we talk about small modular reactors, it's sort of this incantation in terms of what it evokes in the mind of the policymaker. And that is something that is neat and tidily made in a factory, driven to site on a flatbed, snapped together like Lego. You don't even really think about the civil works, which are actually the major construction cost driver within nuclear. That's not even mentioned. This fantasy has been sold. When we talk small, this ranges down from something that, yes, you actually could ship out of a factory, but we're talking about trivial amounts of power, 1 megawatt, maybe up to 5 megawatts. That vision of snapping together makes sense, but there's big diseconomies of scale there, and the applications there are very limited to, for instance, in Canada, the potential for use where we have to, say, fly in diesel fuel for remote mining operations or communities. There's a nice story there, but in terms of the pragmatics, it doesn't necessarily come together. In terms of modularity, modularity is not unique to small reactors. The AP1000 that was built, 2 of them have come online in Georgia, were highly, highly modular. modularity is a potential risk. It can deliver enormous benefits. We saw that in Japan with the advanced boiling water reactor. That was the quickest built nuclear reactor in the world, 38 months from first concrete pour to grid connection. Very modular. But if you muck up the supply chain and the project management, that can be a real problem. But in any case, that's not unique to small. And I mean, SMR, you don't even mention the N word. So it's this marketing term that has allowed the industry to scrape by for the last 10 years, but it's sort of become this dangerously inflated monster, which now I think really has the chance to scuttle progress as we move forward. In terms of, let you force that out of me, Aidan. The role of the Decouple podcast is very interesting. I founded it in 2020. It was really just my COVID lockdown coping mechanism. I did a little bit of community radio in my 20s, and I found it just fascinating that you could read an amazing book. If the author happened to still be alive, you could try and track them down, phone them up, and just because you have a radio show, they talk to you. So that's what I was going for with the podcast. I was lonely. Many of us were, I think. But it's really had a remarkable impact, and I'm surprised. I was asking for blurbs for our 4-year anniversary back in May, and I had the director of nuclear for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Jigar Shah, the head of the DOE Loan Programs Office. Ted O'Brien provided a very nice blurb for us. So it's become very well listened to in policy circles, I think, because I think that what I'm capable of doing editorially is finding incredibly well-informed people who have freedom of speech. And the nuclear industry is very, very conflict averse. It's terrified of communication accidents, shall we say. It's a safety culture. It's run by a bunch of engineers, and they're useless with communications. But there is a party line, and it would be hyperbolic to compare it to a North Korean type culture, but it's not far off. And so the industry is bursting at the seams for a desire to talk about these core contradictions, but everyone's terrified to speak them. And because I'm not paid by them and I'm a free agent, I can do that. And then I don't know how, managed to find really, really well-qualified people. And so there's a thirst for it. And just the medium of a podcast, like in the era now of TikTok videos and ADHD attention spans, people are still hungry for that long-form format, hour-long conversations. And as a kind of nuclear mind virus, within an agency like the DOE, they don't have a lot of time and the briefings are short, but if they're out for a run or for a walk or at the gym and they actually want to listen to a podcast and they say, oh my God, and they get the whole team listening to it, it creates this incredible shared mental model. And that's really spread like wildfire. And so the most recent Department of Energy liftoff report was a radical departure. Just the update this year from last year, really recentering large nuclear, making a clear admission that small reactors are less economic, and critically as well, saying that the so-called advanced reactors have a long burn-in time in terms of many more years, perhaps decades of investment and development before they are commercially viable. So that's, I guess, the story of the podcast and my revulsion with the term SMR.
Fantastic, and I can certainly say that Chris and some of his friends were very early in the first and were lonely voices for quite a while, but now they have changed the nature of the narrative, which is incredible. So give us a little teaser. Tell us about how the narrative is going to unfold for Amazon and Google with their advanced nuclear purchase announcements.
Yeah, so I was just claiming a great victory there in terms of the last DOE liftoff report, and then it's all spoiled for me because this week major announcements from the hyperscalers, the folks involved in setting up the data centers that are going to be required for the AI revolution and the incredible thirst for power that they will have. And this is a phenomenon I've really witnessed within the Silicon Valley tech culture. People have made fabulous wealth through tech, through something that is very rapidly reproducible with a click of a button. Consumer electronics that are produced on absolute mass scales, and they've been technology disruptors, and it's very admirable what they've achieved. But they come from that world. And again, man is blind until he has a metaphor that allows him to see. They have the wrong metaphor when they come over to nuclear. And they say, these stupid nuclear engineers, if only they thought more about molten salt reactors or, this concept. Again, these reactors, molten salt reactors, sodium fast reactors, high temperature gas reactors have all been attempted. They got a fair shot, but they did not perform. But there's something that speaks to that sort of tech Silicon Valley psychology of wanting to disrupt that biases them towards some of the choices they've made. So Google announced a partnership with Kairos Energy. They are working on a molten salt reactor. Our water-cooled, water-moderated fleet builds off of 200 plus years of experience since the Industrial Revolution managing pressure vessels, high temperatures, and steam as a working fluid. We have 17,000 hours of operating water-cooled, water-moderated reactors. We have exactly 4 years experience working with molten salt reactors, all within a national lab environment, none commercial, and with hundreds of unplanned outages. And my fear is that we end up, I don't think it's actually going to go anywhere, but if this does proceed, we're going to end up with a power source that's worse than weather-dependent wind and solar, because at least you can predict nightfall. And with very complex weather modeling, it's possible to have some degree of predictions about the inadequacies of the power source. But unplanned outages are as you can see, some of the, not Loy Yang, which has an incredible operational record, but some of the other, I think what I referred to as clunkers, unplanned outages are no bueno. So anyway, that's kind of the commentary on where that's coming from. And why it's a real problem, because the nuclear industry has to start delivering wins. We've seen throughout Europe huge cost and schedule blowouts, in America as well. There is a ray of sunshine in Canada, which is our refurbishments, which are essentially an engine swap out of our nuclear reactors that restores them to an as new condition for another 30 to 40 years of operation. Many CANDU reactors have had that process done. We think we can do a second one, extending these assets to 100 years. But these are major multi-billion-dollar projects, and we are delivering them ahead of schedule and on budget. And that's, truly remarkable. Darlington Unit 3, 3-year refurbishment, could have been interrupted by COVID. Really, there'd be plenty of excuses for it to have been delayed. It came in 169 days, more than 3 months ahead of schedule. So it's something that we're very, very proud of. And given the invulnerability to COVID disruption, that's again a reflection of that incredible supply chain localization, where we weren't dependent. All of our suppliers are in province and just recycling that economic benefit.
Can you tell us about Canada's subsidies? Because we have often an eye to Canada for a success story, particularly Ontario. But recently there's been some people pushing back and saying that Ontario's nuclear power is not a fair measure of how much it costs because there are subsidies in Canada's energy system. Can you clear up what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real challenge comparing electricity prices between the two jurisdictions. Australia has a deregulated market. We have we call it a hybrid market. It's partially deregulated, and there's a mechanism with which to top up certain generators that fits more within the regulated monopoly model. And there are electricity subsidies. So you could say that that's taking cost off of the back of the ratepayer, which is, high electricity prices are regressive. They hurt poor people more than rich people. When you put it onto a progressive tax base, it's a little less burdensome and, a little bit more politically popular to relieve those rates. And so we do have significant subsidies, but the largest subsidy, more than half of it, is the renewable cost shift. And I told you before about the $62 billion expenditure on a tiny fraction. It's extraordinary. That $62 billion investment buys us about 300 terawatt hours. The $58 billion investment in our CANDU fleet has already bought us 3,000 terawatt hours, an order of magnitude more, and it's just at its midlife. So in any case, we spend over $3 billion every single year subsidizing our electricity rates as a result of paying off those feed-in tariff contracts. And we're locked into that for at least another 15 years. I understand Australia, I think just in 2023, there's a energy bill relief fund that's about $3 billion as well. So I think we can leave that aside as a way to sort of distinguish. In the end, we end up with retail prices that are about half of Australia's and emissions that are 1/10. So I think we're doing okay. But I hope that clears up a bit of an unclear situation.
Absolutely. We're just starting with the out-and-out rebates off our energy bills to try to hide what's going on here. So we're well familiar with that. But the final one is I wanted just you to reflect. You have such a brilliant perspective from a global point of view, very familiar with the North American environment. But What is the world thinking about, or what does the world know about or care about Australia's nuclear debate at the moment? What does the international community think about what's going on here in Australia?
I mean, it's a fascinating debate to witness. Again, I sat through a dinner with Aidan and Simon Holmes-Court and another energy modeler, Dylan McConnell. And, again, it was, when you're traveling in a place where you don't speak the language, maybe you speak a few words of the language and you're jet lagged and your brain is just, firing on all cylinders. It's such an alphabet soup of these agencies involved in the modeling effort. So that's one thing that stands out. What's planned in Australia is truly unprecedented in terms of, renewable system. That's 82% in, well, how many years we got left? 6 years?
Yeah, 6 years to get to 82%, and then we've got a long way to go after that.
Right. There are examples, a little bit ahead of you in terms of percentage of renewables on the grid. Denmark comes to mind. But Denmark is interconnected. They have more transmission interconnections, more capacity in their transmission interconnections than they do in terms of their total generation capacity. It's a tiny country. It's networked with reliable German coal on one side and Norwegian hydroelectricity and Swedish nuclear, et cetera. So it's a little anxiety provoking. When I left Australia last year, I thought maybe I was getting off a bit of a sinking ship, but it's sinking very slowly, perhaps. In terms of the nuclear debate, it's astounding to me. I mean, I'm a physician. When I started thinking about nuclear, Helen Caldicott was front of mind. She came and spoke at my university, when I was an impressionable 18-year-old, and I remember her saying, nuclear is actually worse than coal because, all of the embedded emissions in the concrete and steel. And, I nodded along as a, bit of a lefty humanities student at the time. So it's extraordinary seeing a country where nuclear is almost the election issue, where this election is almost a referendum. And there's other issues, obviously, but I never would have anticipated seeing that coming. Lastly, I guess the sort of final reflection is, kind of a note of caution. Because there's so much modeling going on and it's so disconnected, I think there's a tendency to say, okay, well, what happens if we put 10 gigawatts of nuclear on the grid? I mean, I love the idea of it, but we have to be conscious that this is going to be incredibly challenging, and it's going to require the best of the best. I think it's a challenge worth pursuing. To quote JFK, we do not go to the moon because it is easy. We go to the moon because it is hard. The value proposition is there. What kind of a society you want to be left with on the other side of this energy transition is very important. I met with Chris Bowen's chief of staff when I was here last year. I had that rare privilege. And I asked him, do you really think that you're going to be able to run aluminum smelters on wind and solar? He said, Mike, you're forgetting about the batteries. Sorry about the accent there, but those are words that came out of his mouth. We also, if I could just take one more second, Aidan, to regale you with the story. We had Dan Zavatero from the Minerals Council was there with us, and he reminded me, Bowen staffer and I had a battle of the incubators. Again, this idea of tinkering with something as critically important as the grid. My visceral connection to that is that my son was born 7 weeks early and spent 5 weeks in an incubator. And, again, Rosie Barnes talking about, with demand response, we'll just get the hospitals to drop off the grid and use their diesel gensets, so we can better, load follow. That kind of irresponsibility is shocking, to say the least. Well, Bowen staffer said, well, my son was born 8 weeks early, and that's why hospitals have diesel backups. Don't worry about it. And so that kind of irresponsibility, I just find utterly shocking. And it's, I guess, a kind of maybe immaturity it's definitely an immaturity that I see in a spectrum of the debate here. So I hope that provides some of my reflections.
Thank you.
You mentioned there are 3 widely deployed families of reactors, of which CANDU is one. Which of those 3 should Australia be implementing?
I'll try not to be horribly biased here, but listen, I think if you can get them, the Koreans have a decent track record in terms of project delivery. I think that Westinghouse has a fabulous design in the AP1000. They have not been able to build it effectively in the U.S. China struggled with it as well, but hopefully they can get those processes in place. And the Chinese are building more and more AP1000s now, and they've really tightened up the construction schedule to meet their sort of median build time of 5.5 to 6 years. Obviously, I would be askew if I didn't try and promote the CANDU. I'm not paid by the industry whatsoever, but I think it's a really fabulous reactor design. You do not require enrichment. We're both countries with well endowed with uranium, natural uranium, and again, it makes you independent. You don't need the kind of heavy forging capacities, which explain why we went our own way. And we're about to build 2 new reactors in Romania. Some of the civil works were done under Nicholas Gillette. I'm blanking on his name, but we're done some time ago. But so you'll be able to sort of watch and see how we do. But I'm very confident in Canada. We built those 20 reactors in 22 years. We went on to have a vibrant export industry. Exports dried up, and we started into a refurbishment cycle. So we are very tooled up. We didn't have this devastating 20 or 30 years of inactivity, which has really plagued the European and American sectors.
Yes, I was fascinated to hear about the success of the nuclear program in Canada. But as you pointed out, Canada doesn't have any coal, whereas we have perhaps 200 or 300 years of supply of coal at very, very cheap. And an energy economist, Alan Moran, I don't know if you met him, but he's published studies over many years, but most recently arguing that that nuclear is far cheaper than renewable energy, as you're pointing out, when you consider all the costs of meeting peak loads and so on. But he finds that in the Australian environment, coal is still far cheaper than nuclear, about a half to. So nuclear would be 2 to 3 times dearer and would take a lot longer. And speaking about the employees, your 81,000 employees, we still have many thousands of coal employees in the existing energy field, which if these generators close down, our whole system would collapse. I personally have put in a backup generator, gas-fired, because fearing we're going to have permanent blackouts very soon. So I think some combination of rapid build of efficient coal stations and with some nuclear stations as well in the mix in the longer term.
We were out at Loy Yang, and I think there's no doubt that, a mine mouth brown coal plant, there's nothing cheaper. And that kind of remains a policy question in terms of, phasing out coal in Australia. And I won't comment too much other than, we did have a coal fleet. We didn't have the coal in the ground. And so we made a strategic choice to go nuclear. And talking about those high quality jobs in the Latrobe Valley or the Hunter Valley, there's this marketing term called the just transition that's all over sort of pamphlets in academia, crisp work boots with no stains on them. And, they're kind of betrayed in terms of the images you see on the front covers of them. But we experienced a real just transition. A good friend of mine, Dan Campbell, was an operator at the North America's largest coal station, a 4 gigawatt black coal station. And he is now an authorized nuclear operator at the world's largest operating nuclear station at Bruce Power in Ontario. And if you want to learn more about his story, jump on Decouple.
Chris, can you put some more skin on the bones around, or flesh on the bones around the concept of localisation as that might pertain to Australia on the basis that we don't have homegrown nuclear technology and we don't have an existing workforce? So what does that look like to you?
Yeah. I can comment from my experience in the UAE. I had the pleasure of touring the Baraka nuclear facility on the sidelines of COP28 in November. This tends to be, I think, a rule really with nuclear deployments, that localization. So they're doing cabling, a variety of other nuclear certified kit and equipment for the nuclear industry. They're now consulting with other countries in terms of those jobs. And they've set up a whole network of suppliers. I'm more familiar with the Canadian example. So we exported a CANDU reactor to Argentina, which was just recently refurbished. And we did send down some Canadian experts and some equipment. but they have developed the capacity to manufacture the fuel and to really carry out that entire refurbishment process on their own. If they wanted to build another CANDU unit, they could do it independently. I'm sure we'd come down and give them a slap on the back and some advice and some technical assistance, but we see that in Korea, where one of the first nuclear parts of their indigenous industry was manufacturing CANDU fuel bundles. High precision, but certainly achievable. So I think, particularly with that natural uranium side, the value add to your uranium of turning it into an actual fuel element is massive. So I won't say I've done a detailed study on this, but certainly anecdotally and doing research, you really do see this supply chain localization, and you can frankly see the opposite with wind and solar. There used to be a fairly vibrant solar industry in Europe, for instance, and you can't get past those comparative advantages of ultra-lax environmental laws, slave labor in Xinjiang province, for instance, and the kind of state subsidy that can really dominate in something like the solar supply chain.
Hi, my name's Andrea Kosh. I work in agriculture. Well done for going to St. Anard. But there's a much bigger and deeper story to unpack there. We're talking about 10,000 kilometres of transmission infrastructure all up and down the eastern seaboard into South Australia and Tasmania. Absolute white-hot anger, tearing apart of social capital, natural capital, and financial capital. I'm just wondering, is there something there that you guys can talk a little bit more about?
Sure, if you want, I'm happy to take that one. I think it's a really transmission in my mind is the real fork in the road point. It's the asset that things hinge on very much. All our other problems move a little bit more slowly and gradually. We install solar panels and wind farms in relatively smallish steps, and the generating companies have to pay for those, or at least get finance or a subsidy that's sort of transparent and easy. And I know that transmission lines, in terms of their impact on the rural community, they're large and linear. They have to fully connect. You can't skip a nice bit. You have to go around it, and that does generate huge anger. And also I think it's a harbinger. People know what it means comes with it. People know that once you've built the transmission, you have paid maybe nearly half, but like a big part of the cost of supporting a flourishing or kind of expansive, massive expansion of wind and solar too. So I think it's the critical thing that moves very quickly. Our coal fleet will slowly degrade and get less reliable as we don't invest in it, but we could probably reinvest in that if we wanted to. But building a transmission line that lasts for 50 or 60 years and that scars the landscape and lays down the highway for all the other investments, I think is a critical thing. And so I think that the key thing we've been doing, the hot anger is in the bush. We've seen a little bit of that, but connecting that to a business case that I think is flawed. That's been one of our major projects at CIS, is to be really critical and clinical in trying to see whether the economics at the very high level to justify spending users' money on building that does stack up. And we've found that very wanting in many cases. So I think that the economics is the key there, to be absolutely methodical and be willing to go into the detail to discover whether that stacks up, because that is the fork in the road. Once we've built that stuff, as Chris said, there's no other reason to run these huge industrial kind of towering projects into the guts of our rural areas. So it's got no other useful purpose. So what we spend on that will be instrumental.
Hi, Chris. John Simons. You've given the example of metaphor being important to help people see. And this country is one where we have deep political polarisation over the topic of nuclear, and we have motivated reasoning on both sides. In a sense, nuclear is being a metaphor which is helping the right to step into climate reality. You've seen in the United States the Democrats, where we've basically now got almost 100% support for nuclear in the Democrats. What are the metaphors that have enabled the left to see in nuclear in North America?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, it is a phenomenon indeed. In that hyper-polarized environment, you can find one issue, I think, in one issue alone where there's bipartisan support. In terms of that explanation, I mean, a real test case was the Diablo Canyon nuclear station. We think of that as our sister station to Pickering. At least we did in that struggle. We were working alongside activists there. In that scenario in California, the governor, Gavin Newsom, has presidential ambitions. And the state, very far along in terms of its wind and solar development, it's becoming obvious it was it was teetering on the edge of blackouts, and without Diablo Canyon, would fall into that dreadful reality. So, there's a very pragmatic decision there, and it was extraordinary within the Senate in California. It was near unanimous, and it's very democratically controlled. So there's pragmatic reasons there. I do think that the climate issue has really reshaped attitudes on the left towards nuclear. That's absolutely undeniable. We've sort of left behind a lot of the Cold War fears, despite the missiles still sort of pointing towards each other. We're sort of, I think, managing to stay, at least my generation, blissfully unaware as much as possible. I'm going to think about that and reflect on it a bit more. I don't have a snappy metaphor to throw your way. But I think a combination of pragmatism and climate concern, and I think a winning argument really is the labor issue. And I'm a nonpartisan person, and I would never want to be a politician. I love influencing politics. It's been a very, very powerful tool to convince the right, who happen to be in power in my province, to do the right thing, and kind of cement for that blue-blue alliance is nuclear. It is, again, what sustains those workers. It's the kind of jobs that keep them employed in the highest quality work in the safest environment with the best wages. And so I think that's a potential entry point. Again, in Australia, that's tricky because you don't have the inertia of already having those workers there. But that specter of a just transition for those coal workers into jobs that pay 40-50% of their current salaries. I mean, what an injustice. And so potentially there's some potential movement there.
Thank you. Dr. Carolyn Curry. I'm very concerned about the reliance on batteries. My father was head of munitions factory during the war, and he would use batteries as bombs. I was not allowed to install a battery by AGL at Blackheath because he said it was high bushfire prone area. So we've installed potential bombs all over Australia on which we're now going to rely. Do you have concern about lithium batteries in view of the fact that we are highly bushfire prone and in view of increasing temperatures in this country?
I was amazed too, because I always thought that batteries were the bit that didn't require much effort for social license. I thought they were sort of easy things that just sat there on a block of concrete and what could possibly go wrong. But the farmers are absolutely concerned. They know what happens if they do burn, and I won't try to quantify how rare it is, but if it happens, you really know about it, and there's nothing you can do to put them out. And they let quite a stench of plume run downstream across the landscape, and it's a really serious issue. The thing that I wasn't aware of, which is a new kind of twist that I learned, is that they are animated about the problem of getting insurance for farmers to host or be in the area of this kind of infrastructure, both for power lines and batteries, because farmers, they do, when operating heavy machinery, fires start. It's a thing that they avoid as much as they can, but everyone knows that starting a fire is one of those things that a farmer will do in their lifetime, and the risk of setting some critical bit of infrastructure on fire that might be worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that results in blackouts is an incredible insurance risk. That's one of the things that I just learned today that that farmers are up in arms about, is how on earth do they insure the risk of them accidentally causing catastrophic damage to a critical piece of infrastructure. So yeah, there is deep concern. I'm not the expert on it, but I'm learning, and it's concerning.
My name's Sandra Burke. I'm from Advance. We have been pro-lobby for some time. I guess Australia obviously lacks the antecedents that you lack in Canada, or that you have in Canada. And I liked your analogy about a slowly sinking ship, but I suspect it's not that slow. We are potentially facing an election soon, perhaps May, perhaps earlier, and we're looking at the very real possibility of a hung parliament with the Greens in majority. And in that sense, then all of our politics move further to the left. And the Greens policy is 100% renewables, which was Labor's policy until they woke up to 82%, which they pulled out of thin air. Do you think that, given the white-hot anger that I've seen personally out across Australia, that we're just doing a faster fail and we're failing to wake up Australia to the very real crossroads that we're facing?
I mean, I think it's a challenge in the modern urbanized world. We don't know where our food comes from. We don't know how the sausage gets made, the proverbial sausage in food, but as well in the material world. We have, luxurious lives. We no longer, the majority of us no longer work as farmers or factory workers. We're completely disconnected from the productive economy, shall we say. That's I think, again, that's also a feature of urban life as well. And so, the energy wonks and nerds amongst us are a very rare breed indeed. And I think figuring out how to communicate within this climate is extraordinarily challenging. It's interesting, in Canada, we have a first past the post system, and I was always very curious and I think supportive of proportional representation and ranked ballot, but it is incredible the kind of anti-democratic powers that can lead. And we see it all over Europe with Green parties getting this kingmaker role. And what do they want? They want the energy ministry. And what do they want to do? They want to kill nuclear or engage in something that's very ideologically destructive. And again, they are tinkering with the life support system. So it's very dangerous. And what you're describing sounds very worrisome indeed.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Chris Keefer and Aidan Morrison.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.